Well, for some reason that I have never really understood, one Sunday evening when I was a young teenager, our church youth group went to see a Billy Graham movie. The movie was A Thief in the Night. Anybody ever see that movie? Really? That movie was my first exposure to a particular brand of Christianity. My first exposure to the idea that there was this rapture coming. And it was a movie that was completely out of character for the church that I grew up in. So I really never did understand why we went to see the movie. The movie told the story of a young woman who is married and who wakes up in the morning and her husband, who went to sleep next to her, is gone. He has been raptured, along with millions of other people throughout the world. And those who are left behind now face the nightmare of a one-world totalitarian government. And you have to remember that this movie came out during the middle of the Cold War, when our big fearful enemy was the communists, that one-world totalitarian government. Face the nightmare of a one-world totalitarian government that would usher in the coming of the Antichrist and eventually the return of Christ. The film was based directly on a passage in Matthew 24 that speaks of the Son of Man coming like a thief in the night, taking some and leaving others behind. But the broader story of that period of tribulation that was depicted in the movie that will follow the rapture, to be consummated by a final battle between the forces of good and evil, the forces of good led by the triumphant Jesus and the forces of evil led by Satan, all comes out of the book of Revelation. I actually didn't remember very much of the movie. I remembered I went to see it, and I had to look up the synopsis online. What I remember was what happened after the movie, what I will never forget as a teenager, because after the movie was over, instead of the lights coming on, we were in a theater, movie theater, and so we could leave, the lights went dark. And we sat there for a moment in the darkness, and then a light went on up front, and a man came up front and stood and said, "Now, every single person who is in here is going to spend some time individually with a couple people to pray for them and their soul." And I cannot tell you how desperately I wanted to get out of that place. And could not, or felt like I could not. And so eventually we sat there, and small groups of us were led out, and I was led into a room with two people who wanted to know if I was ready for the coming rapture and if I was saved. And I honestly could say, I don't know. Was I right with Jesus? I thought I went to church. I was right with Jesus. And I was informed that that was not good enough. And I was also told that if I was not right with Jesus and I was left behind, that what would come would be absolutely awful. And this was my first experience growing up with the wrathful, vengeful, judging Jesus, who would use and will use violence and torture against people who are not his followers in the name of the justice of God. I've been talking this month about God and violence, and I do not believe in any kind of God associated with any kind of violence. But there is violence associated with God in the Bible. It's there. And there's a lot of people, especially people within the Christian community, who believe in a God who will use violence, who does use violence, to accomplish his aims. And there's a lot of people who justify violence, whether it's our military violence or personal violence or violence in the family to keep control of the family in the name of God and doing what is right, coming, as they say, coming out of the Bible. And the book of Revelation is a prime example of a New Testament book that features a Jesus who brings the sword of destruction to vast swaths of humanity and the earth in the name of the justice of God. The book of Revelation is a letter. It's a letter that was written to 7 churches in Asia Minor. Each of those churches at the beginning of the book is named, and a little section is addressed to each church where they are praised. Each church is praised for their faithfulness, but then also given a warning that there are either some people in their church or some factions in their church that are not being faithful and that they face punishment if they don't purge the bad people out of their churches. But then the vast majority of this letter is this apocalyptic vision of the writer who tells of being taken up into heaven and seeing this unfolding prophecy of a great battle to come between the forces of good led by Jesus and the forces of evil led by Satan, with tribulation and persecution to come for a while, and then the final victory. And I'm going to read a short passage. This is from late in the letter, and this is chapter 19. This is where Jesus comes. And then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like the flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems. And he has his name inscribed that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dripped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, wearing fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress with the fury of the wrath of the God Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has a name inscribed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then I saw an angel standing in the sun with a loud voice. He called to all the birds that fly in mid-heaven, "Come gather for a great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of the mighty, the flesh of horses and their riders, the flesh of all, both free and slave, both small and great." And then I saw the beast and the king of the earth, the kings of the earth, with their armies, gathered to make war against the rider on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed in its presence the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast, 666, and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur, and the rest were killed by the sword of the rider on the horse, the sword that came from his mouth, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh. That's Jesus. Modern biblical scholarship is in almost near universal agreement that the book of Revelation is a book that is written near the end of the first century, right about the time when the Christian movement is beginning to experience a little bit of persecution from the Roman Empire, a little bit of more organized persecution from the Roman Empire. And the beast is the Roman emperor. That's who it is. And the letter is a warning to the churches to not conform to Greco-Roman society, which is demonic and which is about to be subject to divine judgment. There are two instances in the Bible of this kind of apocalyptic literature that are rather lengthy. There's some smaller samples. But the book of Daniel, which is a late book in the Old Testament, and then the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the New Testament, are both examples of apocalyptic literature where there is this vision of the seer who sees this cosmic battle that's taking place between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And Revelation, the writer of Revelation, draws heavily on the Old Testament book of Daniel. And this perspective, I mean, where does it come from? You think about where does this kind of perspective come from? And usually it comes from the perspective of a hopeless minority that feels that the world is being run by evil people and by evil forces, and that there is absolutely no hope. They see no hope that in the future, as history unfolds, that things will get better. That those who are in the minority, that those who are being persecuted will ever see the light of day, and that the forces of evil will ever go away. And so with the absence of any hope in history unfolding, they hope then that instead that God will come in some form or another as the Son of Man in Daniel, or as the Son of Man as Christ in the book of Revelation, and intervene and set things right. And within some elements of the Christian community, including, I might add, historically in the Anabaptist communities of the Brethren and the Mennonites, who often faced persecution in Europe, there was periods of their history where they had a strong apocalyptic hope that that was the only way we were going to get out of this mess that we are in when God comes back. But this is the violent Jesus, leading the army of God, bringing death and destruction to unbelievers and evildoers. And this is one of the legitimate visions of Jesus that is found in the Bible. And, it's in there. And it's one that over the centuries of Christianity has had always some kind of following. There's always been some people within the Christian community, usually small groups who are in the minority, who have gone out there and gathered on the hill and believing they got the date. They've read this book carefully and they figured out the date when Jesus is coming back. And they go up there on the hill and they wait for Jesus' return, and then they get it wrong. And they come back down and they recalculate, and eventually they do it a couple times and then they give up. Or some of them never give up. They're constantly recalculating that date. What's interesting to me about this is that why is it so popular among so many American Christians who in no way, shape, or form are in the minority, whose way of life is not threatened by anyone else, really, who have incredible power and wealth, and yet still see this and hold to this vision. And part of it is the fact that we find ourselves in these big struggles with other worldviews, like we did with communism, and now like we seem to, at least some think we are in the midst of an epic battle with Islam, and so they become the focus of what the Antichrist means. It was communism, and now it's, for many people, it's Islam. The latest iteration of this version of Jesus that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, even if at least by name, if you never read the books or saw the movie, is the Left Behind series. Anybody read the Left Behind series? Michael will not be left behind. No. He read. Those books were bestsellers, on the bestseller list for months and months and months. And then the movie, was it one movie or more? I don't even know. It was a big hit. I didn't read the books, or I did not see the movie. And I got online, actually was hoping to show a segment of the movie today. I have an Amazon Prime account, but it's not available through Amazon Prime. The only way to get it is to buy it. I'm not buying that movie. So we don't get to see a segment of the movie. But fortunately, lots of elements are available to read on the internet. And in the last installment of the series, which was called Glorious Appearing, Jesus returns, and there merely raised one hand a few inches, and a yawning chasm opened in the earth, stretching far and wide enough to swallow all of them. They tumbled in, howling and screeching, but their wailing was soon squashed, and all was silent when the earth closed itself again. In Glorious Appearing, Jesus merely speaks, and the bodies of the enemy are ripped open. And Christians have to drive carefully to avoid hitting splayed and filleted bodies of men and women and horses. The novel continues, the riders not thrown leaped from their horses and tried to control them with the reins. But even as they struggled, their own flesh dissolved, their eyes melted, and their tongues disintegrated. Seconds later, the same plague afflicted the horses, their flesh and eyes and tongues melting away, leaving grotesque skeletons standing before they too rattled to the pavement. I don't know. Jesus was not an animal lover, apparently, in this version. So, in this book, in the last version of the book, Jesus comes back and just wipes out everyone who's not Christian and all of everything about them. When that book came out, or when the last book came out, New York Times columnist David Ignatius said at the time, imagine if a Muslim were to write an Islamic version of this and publish it in Saudi Arabia, jubilantly describing a massacre of millions of non-Muslims by God. How we would react. And yet, we are okay with this, at least many members of the Christian community are okay with this because they think it's biblical. They think it fits into this grander narrative of history that we are part of. They look around and they see Islam and the rise of Islam and see the threat that they perceive there. They look at the struggle in the Middle East and the struggle that's been going on now for decades and decades over the Jerusalem, the holy city of God. And what they see in all of that is the unfolding of the book of Revelation. It's coming to pass. And within that narrative, there is justifiable use of violence in the name of God. And there are a lot of people who believe that version of the story. In part because they say, and it's true to a certain extent, that it's biblical. This is why it's important, or I think it's important, to know something about the Bible and then to be willing to talk about it. And maybe even in a Christian way to argue about it. I find that lots of Christians today chafe at being reminded that as they pick out scriptures, for instance, depicting homosexuality as a horrible sin, so Christians once picked out scriptures that supported keeping blacks as slaves. No, it's not the same. It's not the same. They were wrong. The problem is that those passages that can be found to support slavery. They're in the Bible. And in the 19th century, some Christians used them to justify supporting the institution of slavery. Just as some use Bible passages today to support their views on homosexuality. And some people use the book of Revelation to feed a frenzy of fear about Islam and to justify using violence in the name of God because it's biblical. And I think we need to be able to say that, yes, you're right. It's there. It's in there. There's no denying it. But it's still wrong. It may be in the Bible, and it can be wrong still. Because the Bible reflects the views of people who wrote about their communities and about their understanding of how God was interacting with them. But the Bible did not drop out of heaven as the Word of God. It was created by those communities with all of their prejudices and limitations of vision. And so it may be in the Bible, it can still be wrong. And it's not helpful. It feeds intolerance. It depicts moderate views as even worse than evil, which is also there in the book of Revelation. If you are one of those people who wants to moderate and be a voice for bringing people together, you are a lukewarm, not a hot Christian. And you're worse than the hot or the cold. It depicts the moderate voices as worse. And it's just simply in the midst of all the conflict and all the struggle that we have in our lives and in our world, it's the worst way to go about moving forward. It does not resolve conflict, to respond to violence with violence. And it is most certainly not the only picture of Jesus and God that is found in the Scriptures. There is a better way depicted there. There is a much better memory of Jesus depicted in the Scriptures. I mean, I'll be talking more about this next week, but just the contrast between Jesus on the white horse with the sword coming out of his mouth, leading an army, contrasted with the picture of Jesus coming into Jerusalem riding the donkey, which historically in that day and age within the Jewish community meant that you were a leader who is coming to bring peace, not war. The contrast between those two visions is stark. There's a way better memory of Jesus, and there's a way better hopeful and loving image of God. And so it's important, I think, to know that these passages are here, to read them, to be familiar with them, and to be able to acknowledge, yeah, it's there. And then to be able to say, but I still think there's a better way. It's not the only picture of Jesus, it's not the only picture of God, and we all pick and choose the version that we want. Honestly, we do. We all read through the Bible and we pick and choose the version that we want. And the question is, the important question, I think, is how does that vision of Jesus, that vision of God, help us to make the world that we live in a more hopeful, more loving, more peaceful place that dissolves tension, that dissolves and resolves conflict, and that gives our children something to look forward to that's better than what we have in our world. And that's the test of Scripture, I think, that matters. And I'll be talking more about that next week. Thank you for listening.